Hitler and Hirohito, the swastika and the rising sun. We've all seen the footage, the smiling diplomats, the firm handshakes, the signing of the Tripartite Pact in 1940 that was supposed to carve up the world between Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo. The propaganda told us they were brothers in arms, united against the Allies, destined to reshape civilization itself. But what if I told you that was a lie? What if I told you that behind closed doors, Hitler referred to his Japanese allies as lacquered monkeys? What if I told you the Japanese viewed the Germans as just another arrogant white colonial power trying to muscle into Asia? And what if I told you that in the dark jungles of the Pacific, Japanese soldiers didn't just distrust Germans, they massacred them? Men, women, nuns, and infants, their own allies, murdered in cold blood aboard a Japanese warship while loud music played to drown out the screams. This is the story of the Akikaze incident, the bloodiest stain on the Axis alliance that your history books never taught you. And by the end of this, you'll understand why the so-called brotherhood between Germany and Japan was nothing more than a convenient fiction, one that collapsed into murder the moment it became inconvenient. Let's start with something most people don't realize. Germany and Japan fought two completely separate wars. They never coordinated a single battle plan. They never launched a joint operation. They barely shared intelligence until it was far too late to matter. Compare that to the Allies, who, despite their own tensions, managed to coordinate the largest amphibious invasion in human history on D-Day. The Axis? They couldn't even agree on who owned what territory. And nowhere was this dysfunction more apparent than in a forgotten corner of the Pacific, a place called Papua New Guinea. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Before World War I, the northeastern portion of New Guinea wasn't Australian territory, it was German. They called it Kaiser Wilhelm's Land, and it was one of Imperial Germany's colonial possessions in the Pacific. When Germany lost the First World War, Australia took control of the territory under a League of Nations mandate. But here's the thing. The German missionaries who had been living there for decades were allowed to stay. Catholic priests, Protestant ministers, nuns running schools and orphanages. They had built communities. They had converted local populations. They had been there so long that New Guinea felt more like home than Germany ever had. So when World War II erupted and Japan began its lightning conquest of the Pacific, these German missionaries found themselves in a peculiar position. They were citizens of the Third Reich. Their homeland was allied with Japan. Surely, they thought, the arriving Japanese forces would treat them as friends. Some of them even waved swastika flags as Japanese troops marched into their villages, expecting to be greeted as fellow members of the Axis partnership. They could not have been more wrong. You see, the Japanese military in 1942 and 1943 was not thinking about diplomatic niceties. They were paranoid. They were stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle, and they were losing. The Battle of Midway had shattered their carrier fleet. Guadalcanal was bleeding them dry. American bombers were beginning to appear in skies that Japan had once dominated completely. And in this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, the soldiers on the ground looked at these German missionaries and saw something very different from allies. They saw white people with radios in the jungle. The Kempe Tai, Japan's brutal military police force, became convinced that these missionaries were spies. It didn't matter that some of them had lived in New Guinea for 30 years. It didn't matter that they had no contact with Allied forces. It didn't matter that there was zero evidence of espionage. The Kempe Tai operated on suspicion, and suspicion was enough to sign a death warrant. What happened next would become one of the most horrifying atrocities committed by one Axis power against another. In March of 1943, the Japanese military command in Rabaul made a decision. The German missionaries had become a problem. They were a security risk, or so the paranoid officers believed, and problems, in the Japanese military's way of thinking, had simple solutions. The missionaries would be eliminated, but it had to be done quietly, cleanly, without any evidence that might cause diplomatic complications with Berlin. So they devised a plan. The missionaries, about 60 people in total, including Bishop Joseph Lorx, priests, nuns, and even small children, were told they were being evacuated. Allied bombing was intensifying, the Japanese explained. For their own safety, they would be transported to a more secure location. It sounded reasonable. It sounded humane. The missionaries, still clinging to the belief that their Axis allies meant them no harm, agreed to go. They were loaded onto a Japanese destroyer called the Akikaze. It was a Minakaze-class vessel, fast and deadly, and it had participated in operations across the Pacific. Now, it had a new mission, one so secret that the captain, Commander Sabe, didn't even know the full details until the ship was at sea. When Sabe opened his sealed orders from the 8th Fleet headquarters, he couldn't believe what he was reading. The missionaries were not being evacuated. They were to be disposed of. All of them. Every man, woman, and child aboard his ship was to be executed and their bodies thrown into the Pacific Ocean. No survivors, no witnesses, no evidence. Even Sabe, a career naval officer hardened by years of war, was shaken. He radioed back to headquarters, asking for confirmation. Surely there had been some mistake. Surely the Imperial Japanese Navy was not ordering him to murder 60 civilians, including nuns and infants, who were citizens of their closest ally. The confirmation came back. The order stood. What happened next aboard the Akikaze is almost too terrible to describe, but history demands that we remember it. The crew prepared the deck for what was about to happen. They strung up a white curtain across a section of the ship so that the victims waiting on the other side couldn't see what was happening to those who went before them. They started the ship's engines at full power, not to go anywhere, but to create noise. Loud, throbbing, mechanical noise that would mask the sound of gunfire. And then, to complete the macabre theater, they played music. Loud music. Anything to cover the screams. One by one, the German missionaries were led behind that white curtain. The method of execution was systematic and brutal. The victims had their wrists tied behind their backs. They were hoisted up by ropes on a pulley system, dangling helplessly. And then they were shot with machine guns. Their bodies were untied and thrown overboard into the Pacific. Then the next victim was brought forward, and the next, and the next. The priests went first, then the nuns. These were women who had dedicated their lives to caring for the sick and educating children in one of the most remote places on earth. They had survived tropical diseases, isolation, and the hardships of missionary life. And now they were being murdered by sailors who wouldn't even look them in the eye. And then came the children. Among the missionaries were nuns who had been caring for orphans, including 2 small Chinese children who had been abandoned and taken in by the Catholic mission. These were not German nationals. They were not missionaries. They were just children, toddlers really, who happened to be in the care of the wrong people at the wrong time. The Japanese sailors threw them overboard alive. When it was over, the crew scrubbed the deck clean of blood. They disposed of any evidence, and then they swore an oath of silence. What happened aboard the Akikaze would never be spoken of. The 60 souls who boarded that ship simply ceased to exist. The Japanese High Command buried the reports. The diplomatic channels to Berlin remained silent. Germany would not learn the truth until after the war was already over, when captured documents and war crimes tribunals finally revealed what their allies had done. Now, you might think this was an isolated incident, a rogue commander, a local atrocity disconnected from the broader Axis relationship, but the truth is far more disturbing. The Akikaze massacre was just the most dramatic example of a fundamental reality. Germany and Japan were never truly allies. They were partners of convenience who viewed each other with suspicion, contempt, and when circumstances demanded it, outright hostility. And nowhere was this clearer than in what happened in May of 1945. By this point in the war, Germany's position was hopeless. The Soviets were closing in on Berlin from the east. The Americans and British were pushing from the west. Hitler was in his bunker, ranting about miracle weapons that would never come. And scattered across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, far from the dying Reich, were the submarines of the Monsun-Gruppe. These were German U-boats that had been sent to operate in Asian waters, far from the heavily defended Atlantic. They operated out of Japanese-controlled ports in Penang, Singapore, and other locations. They were some of the most advanced submarines in the world, packed with technology that the Japanese Navy desperately wanted, and their crews were loyal German sailors who had spent years fighting the Allied navies. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over, and the moment that news reached the Pacific, everything changed. The Japanese Navy moved immediately. With no warning, Japanese soldiers stormed the German U-boats with bayonets drawn. The submarine crews, who had considered themselves safe in Allied ports, suddenly found themselves staring down the barrels of Japanese rifles. They were dragged off their vessels and thrown into internment camps. Their submarines, U-181, U-862, and others, were seized. The iron crosses painted on their conning towers were scraped off and replaced with the rising sun flag. Just like that, Germany's Pacific submarine fleet became Japanese property. There's a bit of irony in what happened next. The Japanese, desperate for any advantage as the war turned against them, tried to operate these captured U-boats. But German submarine technology was sophisticated, and the Japanese sailors who now crewed these vessels had no idea how to use them properly. The submarines that had once terrorized Allied shipping in the hands of trained German crews became nearly useless under Japanese command. They had stolen the weapons, but they couldn't use them. Meanwhile, the German sailors who had spent years fighting for the Axis cause rotted in Japanese prison camps. Some of them would not be released until long after the war ended. Their reward for years of service to the Alliance was imprisonment by their own allies. And this pattern repeated itself in smaller ways across the Pacific. There are accounts of Japanese transport ships where, when disaster struck, Japanese officers made cold calculations about who was worth saving. German sailors and passengers were considered expendable. They were left to drown, while Japanese crew members were rescued. The Brotherhood of the Axis, it turned out, had a very clear hierarchy, and Germans were not at the top. Perhaps no single person embodies the absurdity of the Axis alliance better than a man named Yang Kyung-jong. He was Korean, born when Korea was under Japanese occupation. He was conscripted into the Japanese Imperial Army and sent to fight the Soviets in Manchuria. The Soviets captured him, and because they were desperate for bodies, they put him in a Red Army uniform and sent him to fight the Germans on the Eastern Front. The Germans captured him, and because they too were desperate for bodies, they put him in a Wehrmacht uniform and sent him to fight the Allies on the Western Front. He was eventually captured by American paratroopers on D-Day. Think about that for a moment. One man, forced to fight for three different armies in the same war, ending up on the beaches of Normandy in a German uniform, despite having started the war as a Japanese conscript. If you want to understand how meaningless the Axis alliance truly was, look no further than Yang Kyung-jong. He was a Korean man in a German uniform who had fought for Japan and the Soviet Union. The Axis powers weren't united by ideology or brotherhood. They were chaos wearing matching armbands. So what does all of this tell us? Why does the Akikaze incident matter? Why should we care about the breakdown of an alliance between two powers that history has rightly condemned? Because it reveals a fundamental truth about the nature of the Axis partnership. We often speak of World War II as a conflict between two alliances, the Allies and the Axis. But that framing suggests a symmetry that never existed. The Allies, for all their disagreements, coordinated their efforts. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met repeatedly. They planned joint operations. They shared intelligence. They made strategic decisions together, even when they didn't trust each other. The Axis did none of these things. Germany and Japan fought two separate wars on opposite sides of the planet. They had no joint command structure. They had no coordinated strategy. They barely communicated at all beyond diplomatic pleasantries. Hitler made decisions about the European War without consulting Tokyo. Tojo made decisions about the Pacific War without consulting Berlin. They were allies in name only, bound together by a piece of paper that meant nothing when tested by the realities of war. And when the mask slipped, when Japanese officers on the ground had to decide whether to treat German civilians as allies or enemies, they chose murder. When Japan had to decide whether to honor their alliance with defeated Germany or seize German military assets for themselves, they chose betrayal. The propaganda posters showed unity. The reality was two empires who happened to be fighting the same enemies, nothing more. The Akikaze incident remains one of the darkest footnotes of World War II. 60 innocent people, priests, nuns, children, murdered by their own allies because fear and racism trumped any notion of partnership. The white curtain, the roaring engines, the music played to mask the executions, the babies thrown alive into the ocean. These images should haunt us, not because they change the moral calculus of the war. Germany and Japan committed far greater atrocities against millions of others, but because they reveal the hollowness at the heart of the Axis. There was no brotherhood, there was no shared vision, there was only convenience, contempt, and in the end, blood. The only thing Germany and Japan truly shared was defeat. And perhaps that was always inevitable, because an alliance built on hatred, hatred of other races, hatred of democracy, hatred of the existing world order, cannot sustain itself when that hatred turns inward. The Axis wasn't defeated just by Allied armies and superior resources. It was defeated by its own fundamental nature. You cannot build a lasting partnership on a foundation of racial contempt. The missionaries aboard the Akikaze learned that lesson in the most terrible way possible. They died believing they were among friends. They died because the friendship they believed in never existed at all. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.